Spring 1984, a stand at McDonald's on the east side of Detroit. A 14-year-old white kid sits across the table from seasoned federal agents. He isn't a suspect. He isn't in trouble. He is their newest recruit. In a city ruled by ruthless syndicates pushing millions in illicit product, the government didn't send an elite task force. They sent a middle schooler. They literally handed him fake IDs. They financed his rise. They taught him the rules of the underworld. And when he did exactly what they trained him to do, the system locked him in a cage for 32 long years. Meanwhile, the men who pulled the strings retired to luxury casinos. This is his story. Let's get into it. But before we dive into the madness, let me know down in the comments, where are y'all tuning in from today? Drop your city or country down below. And look, if you rock with these raw, unfiltered stories, hit that subscribe button real quick. We're a small channel, so every single sub helps me keep these files coming. All right, let's rewind. Let me paint the picture. Welcome to the east side of Detroit in the mid-1980s. The Motor City was bleeding out. The colossal auto plants that built the American middle class were boarding up their heavy steel doors, leaving behind abandoned blocks, shattered families, and a massive economic void. Let me keep it real with y'all. When legitimate money completely leaves a city, pure survival takes its place. And into that devastating vacuum poured a tidal wave of illicit substances that fundamentally rewired the entire local economy. This wasn't just a random street problem. This was the direct result of systematic urban decay, historical redlining, and the brutal reality of the government's war on narcotics. The system intentionally marginalized these exact public housing projects for decades, essentially creating the perfect, desperate breeding ground for highly organized syndicates. No one capitalized on this devastation better than the Curry organization. Johnny and Leo Curry weren't just moving a little bit of weight, they were running a massive corporate empire. Federal agencies estimated this single network distributed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of the merchandise straight through the east side. They operated with absolute military precision, rolling in customized luxury vehicles through deeply impoverished streets, completely untouchable, deeply insulated, and fiercely protective of their supply lines. The feds and the Detroit police were completely outmatched. They were standing on the outside, just looking at an impenetrable fortress. The Curry Syndicate was tightly knit, exclusively black, and highly suspicious of outsiders. A federal agent in a cheap suit couldn't just walk into a neighborhood drop house and start asking questions. They needed an insider. The authorities were growing absolutely desperate to find a weak link, somebody who could move quietly and gather solid intelligence without meeting a violent end. But think about this for a second. How do you actually infiltrate the core of the most powerful, ruthless organization in the city when the streets are tracking every single move you make? How does the FBI bypass that heavy security? You don't send a cop, you don't send an undercover agent. You find someone so entirely out of place that the local heavyweights would never, ever view them as a legitimate federal threat. Not in a million years. Now into these streets, spring 1984. A standard McDonald's booth in East Detroit. The air smells like cheap grease and stale coffee. Richard Wershe Jr. sits nervously across from FBI agent James Dixon. Wershe Sr. is a street-level hustler, a guy moving questionable hardware from his living room just to keep the lights on. He brought his 14-year-old son, Rick, along for the ride. To the FBI, this was supposed to be a routine recruitment. They wanted the father to be their eyes and ears against the Curry organization. Dixon slides a stack of grainy surveillance photos across the table, pictures of top-tier figures in the syndicate. He looks at the father, waiting for names, but Wershe Sr. is drawing a blank. He doesn't know these men. He can't help the feds. Then a voice pipes up. It's the 14-year-old kid. Rick points a small finger at the black and white photos. He starts naming them, not just their street names, but their real names. He maps out their exact hierarchy. He knows who runs which block, who handles the heavy product, and who physically moves the cash. Agent Dixon just stares at the boy. The FBI has spent millions trying to map this network. And this middle schooler just decoded the whole damn thing over a plate of fries. Now, let me keep it real with y'all. Federal guidelines are strictly black and white when it comes to this. You do not use a minor as a confidential informant. You definitely do not send a child into the absolute belly of the most dangerous, heavily armed syndicate in the entire state. The risk of that kid meeting a violent end is astronomically high, but the government was desperate. And when the system is desperate, it finds a loophole. The FBI drafted the official paperwork. They legally registered Richard Sr. as the paid informant. On paper, the father was the one earning the government checks and taking the risks. But out on the concrete, the reality was terrifying. It wasn't the father wearing the hidden recording devices. It wasn't the grown man walking into heavily fortified drop houses surrounded by shooters. It was 14-year-old Rick. The feds strapped a wire to a child's chest and sent him walking right into the lion's den. He was dealing directly with paranoid men who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone asking the wrong questions. Now think about this for a second. How does a scrawny 14-year-old white kid manage to fool the most notoriously ruthless black syndicate in Detroit without getting himself taken out immediately? It worked entirely because of their blind spot. The Curry organization checked everyone, but their own street prejudice worked against them. No heavyweight boss believed the federal government would ever be crazy enough to use a suburban-looking teenager as an undercover operative. They looked at Rick and just saw a harmless, naive kid wanting to hang out with the big dogs. He was the ultimate ghost, a perfect, invisible weapon designed entirely by the state to break an unbreakable empire. And that's not justice, that's cold arithmetic. The FBI handed the teenager the absolute keys to the Detroit underworld. They gave him the training, the funding, and the green light, and they were about to push him even deeper into the fire. Now, into this highly restricted underworld steps Richard Wershe Jr. He is 14 years old, he isn't carrying a badge, and he certainly doesn't have the physical stature of a street enforcer. But what he does have is the absolute, unquestioning financial backing of the United States government. The FBI and the Detroit Police Task Force actively engineered his rise to power. If you want to catch a kingpin, you have to convincingly look at and spend like one. The feds opened up the vault, handing Rick approximately 35,000 ILs in taxpayer cash. Let me paint the picture. A 14-year-old kid who shouldn't even be out past curfew is suddenly flashing thick rolls of hundreds. He is buying his way into the exclusive VIP sections of the Syndicate, dropping heavy cash on the table. Money authorized and supplied by the very agency trying to tear the neighborhood down. That ain't an organic rise to power. That is a state-sponsored hostile takeover. But the task force needed him to go much further. The Curry organization wasn't just a local crew. They were an enterprise laundering massive amounts of capital across state lines. They were flying to Nevada, sitting at the high roller tables, washing the proceeds of the product through the casinos to make it look legitimate. The FBI needed eyes in the desert. They needed someone who could shadow these men without raising red flags. So what did the federal government do? They forged official documents. They manufactured a highly convincing fake ID for a minor who wasn't even legally old enough to hold a standard learner's permit. They booked the flight, secured the hotel, and cleared the path. In April 1985, they put this teenager on a commercial airliner and sent him straight to Las Vegas. Imagine the sheer absurdity of this cinematic scene. A kid draped in a custom mink coat, wearing a diamond-encrusted Rolex, carrying thousands in federal funds, walking smoothly through a Vegas casino. He is sitting mere feet away from the most dangerous men in Michigan, tracking their money laundering operations and reporting every single detail back to his handlers. He blended in perfectly because no one would ever suspect this flashy white teenager was actually the most effective intelligence asset the Detroit Task Force had ever produced. Now think about this for a second. The federal agents weren't just passively observing him, they were his active instructors. To maintain his ironclad cover, they explicitly ordered him to physically engage in the trade. They instructed him on exactly how to purchase the product, the complex logistics of wholesale distribution, precise profit margins, and specific methods to avoid local law enforcement detection. They essentially handed a high school kid a master class in building an illicit empire using federal protocols. He became tightly woven into the intricate fabric of the Curry Syndicate. He was trusted, he was eating at their tables, he was virtually untouchable. Until the violent reality of the streets finally caught up with the federal illusion, because in this world, no cover is completely bulletproof. Paranoia runs deep. The pressure is suffocating, and eventually somebody starts asking the wrong questions. When Rick was just 15 years old, a dispute ignited. Tensions flared within the ranks over suspected leak. Suspicions boiled over in an instant. and the situation went critical without any warning. There was no grand Hollywood standoff, just a sudden, violent confrontation on the concrete. The steel was drawn, a .357 Magnum projectile was discharged at point-blank range, tearing directly through the 15-year-old's abdomen. It was a catastrophic, life-altering injury. The high-caliber impact completely shredded his intestines. He was rushed to the emergency room, fading incredibly fast, clinging to life by an absolute thread. The trauma surgeons managed to save him after grueling hours on the operating table, but the physical toll was unimaginably brutal. A 15-year-old boy who should have been complaining about algebra exams and high school dances was wheeled out of the hospital permanently scarred, forced to wear a colostomy bag attached to his side. Now look, let me keep it 100 with y'all. According to every single ethical standard, every rule of engagement, and basic human decency, this is the exact moment the operation permanently shuts down. If your confidential informant, especially a minor who can't even vote, takes a .357 projectile to the gut, you immediately pull them out. You extract the asset. You put them and their family into a federal witness protection program. You issue them a new name and you relocate them far away from the danger zone. But here's where it gets complicated. And this, I genuinely believe, is the most underrated and chilling part of the entire story. I spent hours digging through these classified files and court records, and this personally caught me off guard. It made me sick to my stomach. The FBI handlers visited him. They looked at a child with a colostomy bag recovering from a near-fatal wound, and they didn't see a tragedy. They didn't see a victim. They saw a golden opportunity on the volatile streets of the East Side, surviving a .357 Magnum at point-blank range. Doesn't make you a target. It makes you an absolute legend. The streets respect survival above all else. The federal agents quickly realized that this horrific injury gave Rick an unprecedented, untouchable level of street credibility. He had taken a heavy hit and kept his mouth completely shut. To the Curry organization, that proved his unwavering loyalty. He hadn't folded under pressure. He had earned his stripes through sheer brutal resilience. So, instead of pulling him out to safety, the federal government weaponized his trauma. They told him to get right back out there. They used his near-death experience as the ultimate VIP pass to push him even deeper into the isolated inner circle of the Syndicate. They knowingly, calculatingly sent a crippled, traumatized teenager back into the exact same violent environment that nearly put him in the ground, all just to secure a few more crucial wiretaps. That's not law enforcement, that's a sacrifice. Rick did exactly what he was told. He leveraged his new heavyweight reputation. He got the FBI everything they ever wanted. He mapped out the entire Curry network, handed the feds the blueprints to the empire, and gave them the exact intelligence required to dismantle an organization that was moving hundreds of millions in narcotics. He delivered the top-tier kingpins on a silver platter, effectively shutting down the city's most feared syndicate. But this raises the ultimate question, man. Let that land for a second. When a child has been extensively trained by the government to operate as a high-level distributor, when he has earned the genuine respect of the most dangerous men in the city, and when he has paid a brutal physical price for the badge, what exactly happens when the state finally gets what it wants? What happens to the engineered ghost when the machine decides to simply pull the plug? The intelligence Rick provided was the final nail in the coffin for the Curry organization. By the time the dust settled, the feds had dismantled the entire operation from the top down. Johnny Curry, the man who had been virtually invincible, was finally staring at a prison cell. And who was the architect of this downfall? A 16-year-old kid who hadn't even finished high school. But then, the most ruthless part of this betrayal unfolded. The second the FBI got their convictions, the second they checked the case closed box on their files, they pulled the plug. They didn't offer Rick protection. They didn't try to reintegrate him into society. They didn't even offer him a pat on the back. They just cut the line. They left a 16-year-old kid entirely exposed in the middle of a war zone they had helped create. No funding, no protection, no guidance, just a teenager with the entire neighborhood knowing he was the one who had dismantled the biggest outfit in town. But here's where the government's master plan backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. They had spent years turning Rick into a lethal instrument of their own design. They hadn't just taught him how to report, they had taught him how to operate. He had watched the Curry brothers, he had studied the logbooks, he had mastered the supply chains, and he had learned exactly how the illicit machinery functioned. So Rick did the only thing he knew how to do. He stepped out on his own. He didn't have the backing of the feds anymore, but he had the knowledge, the network, and the sheer audacity to command it. Rick stepped into that power vacuum with a level of ambition that made the old bosses look like amateurs. Let me paint the picture. You have a 17-year-old kid, legally a minor, essentially running a small nation. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was the loudest person on the block. We're talking about the iconic white Jeep, custom built, cruising the east side with the legendary license plate, the Snowman. He was draped in full-length mink coats that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. He was rocking a Rolex timepiece so heavy it looked like it was dragging his wrist down, flashing diamond rings that caught the streetlights from a block away. The scale of the operation was, quite frankly, absurd. He was moving weight with a level of efficiency that baffled the authorities who were now trying to track him. He wasn't just hustling, he was scaling. He was coordinating shipments, managing logistics, and handling cash in amounts that would make a Fortune 500 CEO blush. Now let that land for a second. This was a teenager, a kid who couldn't even legally order a drink, managing a revenue stream comparable to the GDP of a small country. He was the king of the block, the face of the new era, and the most conspicuous target in the city. He had the money, he had the influence, and he had the total arrogance of a boy who believed he was untouchable because he had once held the keys to the federal kingdom. He had become everything the government trained him to be and everything they now had to destroy. May 1987, the walls were closing in. Rick thought he was playing a game, but the game was already fixed against him. The federal government, the same architects who had constructed his rise, were now actively painting the target on his back. They weren't looking to protect their former asset, they were looking to discard him as the ultimate scapegoat to satisfy the public's thirst for justice in the war on narcotics, a routine traffic stop. That's all it was. But it wasn't just a routine check. This was a setup designed for maximum impact. When the trunk popped, the authorities uncovered 8 kilograms of high-grade merchandise, 8 keys. It was a massive amount, a quantity that guaranteed a life-altering sentence under the brutal Michigan 650 life law. This law was a sledgehammer of justice designed to crush anyone caught with significant weight, regardless of their age or their history. It was the government's ultimate weapon in the war on narcotics, and they used it to bury the kid they had personally groomed. The FBI? They were completely silent. They were ghosts. They didn't come forward to mention that Rick had been their primary informant for years. They didn't testify about the Las Vegas missions, the wiretaps, or the fact that they were the ones who taught him the business. They let the prosecutors strip away the narrative of a boy manipulated by the state, replacing it with the image of a teenage kingpin who was a menace to society. The trial was a blur, brutal, fast, cold. As Rick stood there, barely 17, the system moved with terrifying efficiency. There was no mercy, there was no consideration for his age or the fact that he was, quite literally, a state-sponsored product. The weight of 8 kilograms was his tombstone. Think about this for a second. Johnny Curry, the kingpin who built the original empire, the man responsible for the violence that dominated the city for years, would eventually walk out of prison a free man. But the teenager who served as the government's tool, he was being prepared for a permanent residence behind steel bars. Was this justice or just the calculated cleaning of the evidence? The fall didn't come from a dramatic shootout or a high-stakes standoff. It came from the cold, clinical precision of the legal system, May 1987. A routine traffic stop that turned into a systematic dismantling of Rick's entire existence. 8 kilograms of the product were recovered from his vehicle. That wasn't just a bust, it was the final trigger for a judicial sledgehammer. Under Michigan's draconian 650 life law, the state didn't care about his age, they didn't care that he was 17, they didn't care about the years he spent risking his life for the feds. All they saw were the numbers. 8 kilograms meant mandatory life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent, but the reality was deafening. Rick looked toward the FBI handlers who had spent years guiding his every move, the men who had taught him exactly how to navigate this world. He looked for a signal, a word, anything that would acknowledge the deal, the sacrifice, and the state-sanctioned training. They looked right through him. They didn't utter a single word in his defense. They didn't produce the files that detailed his years of service. They didn't admit that they had essentially built this teenager into the target he had now become. They completely wiped their hands of him to the authorities. Rick wasn't a human being anymore. He was a liability, a loose end that needed to be permanently severed to clean up the records of a botched and unethical investigation. The judge handed down the verdict with a chilling finality: life without parole. That's when the domino effect truly accelerated. The connections he had built, the network he had navigated, the life he had been thrust into, it all crumbled instantly. His associates vanished. The federal handlers retreated into the shadows of their bureaucratic offices. The streets, which had once respected him for his survival, now turned their backs on the kid who had been discarded by the very people who created him. It was a rapid, brutal erasure. He was shipped off to the cold, isolated corners of the penal system, abandoned by the government, forgotten by the public, and left to rot in a cage for a crime he had been trained to commit. There was no sentimentality here. No grand, heroic exit, just the hard, point-blank reality of a 17-year-old being pronounced dead to the outside world. The system didn't just break him, they erased him. The final chapter of Richard Wershe Jr.'s story isn't a victory lap, and it certainly isn't justice. Look at the archives, and you won't find a triumph. You'll find a haunting, frozen image. Imagine a man stepping out of a state penitentiary after 32 years, the entire prime of his life stolen, only to realize the world he helped build had moved on, and the architects of his demise had been promoted. That is the true legacy of this case. A man traded his entire youth for a government-sanctioned role, only to be cast into a concrete abyss the moment he became an inconvenience. When you look at his situation, you don't see the rise and fall of a typical street operator. You see the machinery of a massive, cold, bureaucratic system operating with absolute indifference. The files are closed, the courtroom doors are locked, and the $1 million civil suit is gone, dismissed on a technicality. When you look at Richard Wershe Jr., do you see a victim who was weaponized by the state, or do you see a monster created by the environment he was forced into? There is no clean answer here. There is only the silence of 3 decades and the haunting reality that the people who pulled the strings are still walking free, while his youth is buried under piles of legal paperwork. Was this a true transformation of the system, or is the damage already permanently done? Drop a comment below. If you've been rocking with these real, unfiltered stories, go subscribe to Hood Dossier real quick. Keep it locked.